And we will move on to our last item before taking our lunch, and that is item 7.4. Sitting as the Board of Directors, Lake County Watershed Protection District, consideration of 3 joint funding agreements with the U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Department of the Interior, USGS, for stream monitoring in Kelsey, Clover, and Scotts Creek, for a total amount not to exceed $138,170, and authorize the Water Resources Director to sign. I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Upadhyay or Mr. Palmadow.
Good morning, Board. Thank you for having us today. My name is Angela Palmadow in Lake County Water Resources.
Pawan Upadhyay, Water Resources Director.
And today's item, it's on, right? Okay. Normally, we have one of these string gauge agreements that we put on consent, and that's for the Kelsey Creek gauge up on the mountain. We've been partnering with USGS, United States Geological Survey, on that gauge for many years. This year, if you look at the item, we have 3 gauges, and one of those gauges, we have a multi-year agreement. And so we just wanted to highlight this to the board and request your approval on these agreements. So we have, again, the annual agreement with USGS for the Kelsey Creek gauge. Is that not?
Okay, so should I repeat everything? Yes? I'm loud, so okay.
It really sounded like it was on.
I know. I was listening to it earlier, though, and you couldn't hear some people, so I'll just repeat. I'll repeat. We normally come to the board on the consent item for the 1 gauge that's at Kelsey Creek up on Cobb Mountain every year, and thank you for the board for approving those cost share agreements with the United States Geological Survey. This year we have 3 stream agreements with the United States Geological Survey. So we have Kelsey Creek, we have the Clover Creek diversion, which is there at Clover Creek and Elk Mountain Road. And then we have a 3-year agreement at Scotts Creek and Tule Lake. It's at the bridge, basically. And this agreement for 3 years is paid for through a Wildlife Conservation Board grant we received for hitch habitat projects last year. And so we just wanted to provide opportunity for the board to have any questions, the public to have any questions about these gauge agreements. I will say that the Kelsey Creek gauge is a cost share with USGS, so we always kind of share. It's about 2/3 we pay, and then they pay 1/3 for that. And the other 2 gauges, they're not in cost share, but we are saving money because they're already installed by USGS. USGS is already familiar and doing the calibration on them, the data validation, and all the information that's gathered from these gauges is uploaded into the USGS website. It's also available on the Sierra Nevada River Forecast Network. So all these gauges are useful for flood prediction. They're also useful for flow, monitoring flow for hitch spawning season. So there's multi-purpose for these gauges. You will also notice differences in the gauge agreements for what they're monitoring. So Kelsey Creek is just flow, how tall the water is, how high the water is, and then the flow, cubic feet per second, or CFS. The other 2 gauges have some other parameters like water quality, temp, and this is important because we have hitch spawning in those areas, and so we're trying to collect this water quality information on a continuous scale. So that's why there's some differences in those agreements. Dr. Upadhyay, do you have anything to add to that before I open it up for the board for questions?
Yeah, I think just like saying, I think, so one is like the usual one, but I think the other 2 are the new, right? Yeah, so.
Any questions or comments? Supervisor Green?
Yeah, just want to compliment Water Resource staff again. They move so fast. They're bringing the money in. So in a later item, I'll be discussing our stream gauge situation, and it may not be entirely accurate because I didn't have this before me. The cost share I get has been historically on Kelsey Creek. So the reason we're picking up Clover Creek and Scotts Creek is the feds aren't funding that anymore. So it's nice of us to do that, but was there a cost share prior? Was it fully funded by USGS prior, or what's the history on those 2 new contracts?
Yeah, so both of those gauges were actually supported through a grant through the Blue Ribbon Committee. So the Blue Ribbon Committee for the rehabilitation of Clear Lake approved monitoring funds, and then that was passed down to USGS. USGS then installed those gauges and had them in place for 3 years while they conducted their study that was approved by the Blue Ribbon Committee. And now that study and those funds has terminated, And it's way more expensive to reinstall a gauge and revalidate it once it's been removed from a system than it is to just maintain a stream gauge that's already installed. And then we can have that continuous data, which is priceless, right? If you have gaps in years with data, you could be missing valuable information. And so there really is no cost associated with keeping continuous data in the stream at a gauge that's already been installed. So those gauges were already paid for. We are picking up the Diversion Creek, or the Clover Creek Diversion Channel gauge this year with some allocated hitch flow funds that we put aside in our budget. And then the other gauge at Scotts Creek Bridge, or at Scotts Creek Tule Lake, is being paid for fully by a Wildlife Conservation Board grant. So there's no internal funds being used for that. And that's part of the hydrological study for Tule Lake and Scotts Creek watershed. And then the last thing I'll say is the Clover Creek diversion structure at Elk Mountain Road. I did just apply for continuation funds for that gauge for next year through the DWR Stream Gauge Improvement Program, or CalSIP, hoping that, we'll have funds for this year if this agreement is approved by the board today, and then we'll have funds set up for that gauge to continue next year. Unfortunately, with the way the funds are for that district, that flood district, it's patchwork funds for that gauge. But we'll try to, and when we have grants and things in place, we'll try to maintain that gauge as possible because it's really important.
Yeah, I appreciate the work again. Yeah, the question was sustainability. Obviously, going from grant to grant, it gets a little herky-jerky, but appreciate you picking up the ball after the Blue Ribbon money ran out. Thank you.
I will say that the Blue Ribbon Committee is committed to helping us find funds to continue those water quality monitoring efforts.
All right, thank you for that. And let's go ahead and open it up for public comment. Anyone wish to speak on this item? No hands in Zoom, no one moving in the chamber. Bringing it back to the board for action.
There's nothing further, Chair. Sitting as the Lake County Watershed Protection District, I move to approve the 3 joint funding agreements with the U.S. Geological Survey, U.S. Department of the Interior, USGS, for stream monitoring in Kelsey, Clover, and Scotts Creeks for a total amount not to exceed $138,170, and authorize the Water Resources Director to sign.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much.
Thank you.